Good afternoon. I think we're just about ready to start. Well, thank you very much for joining us today for our afternoon panel session, Connectivity is Commerce. We've had a great start to the festival with the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, Fiona Hislop, kicking off the week, and there's fantastic sessions planned over the next few days, so please join us for as much as you possibly can. I've got a very simple job to do this afternoon, really to welcome you all and to hand over to our chair, Shona McPherson, who's going to manage the afternoon session. Shonag's been a huge supporter of the Chamber for many years, and indeed was our first female president. In fact, Shonag and I were reflecting over the weekend, can't believe that it's almost a year to the day since we held our annual awards dinner 2020, when I had the great pleasure of presenting the Lifetime Achievement Award to Shonag. And I remember as she accepted her award, that she talked about the importance of the Chamber in connecting her over her career to many people and many organisations across Edinburgh and Scotland, and how important that connectivity is. And I think that we, as a Chamber, over the last 12 months, I've tried hard to continue that connectivity. We've continued with our virtual events and created that vital platform for people to continue to engage and to share their stories, their experiences and their ideas as we've gone through these difficult 12 months. We will continue that theme as much as possible, but I think it's a really good segue into the importance of connectivity in many ways. And this panel session is also about the physical connectivity of keeping Scotland open. So I'm really just going to hand over to Shonag. We've got stellar panelists for you, and delighted that Shonag has joined us today. So welcome. I'm going to switch off and enjoy the discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Shonag. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Liz, for that warm welcome, and welcome to all of you today. Over the last 11 months or so, I suspect many of us have thought of connectivity through digital connectivity and our way of meeting today. But with the advent of the vaccine at the tail end of last year, and the light being at the end of the tunnel, when we hope we will be able to return and open up our businesses, it's timely that we all should now cast our minds onto the importance of physical connectivity, and bearing in mind that we have also had to keep that physical connectivity well and truly going to ensure export, imports, vital supplies reach our customers and we receive what we need from our supply chains. And the importance of frictionless connectivity has been demonstrated since the turn of the year with EU exit, and perhaps we'll talk about how we can circumvent some of that during our discussions today. What I'd like us all to think about this afternoon is the role of connectivity in our economic recovery. How do we build a future economy for Scotland? How do we ensure that through physical connectivity, we have a much more inclusive society? And just 8 months away from today of COP26 in Glasgow, what role does transport have in helping us reach those very important net zero targets? What further investment will be needed? What new services will we require? And what will it cost? At the weekend, we saw Heathrow announcing additional duties there to meet COVID costs. And of course, we've had the announcement this morning of increases in rail fares. We have an excellent expert panel of road, rail and aviation experts, along with the increasingly important transport tech. Each of the panelists are going to make some opening remarks, and then I'll ask them a few questions. But what I would ask you to do is think about the questions you would like to put to these experts, the question and answer function is open, and please pop your questions in there as soon as you are ready. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first panelist. And in Edinburgh, really, he needs no introduction. He's our very own Mr. Aviation. That's Gordon Dewar from Edinburgh Airport. He's been Chief Executive at Edinburgh Airport since 2012. And since then, he has overseen a quite phenomenal and exceptional capital investment programme in the airport and seen passenger growth over that time in excess of 60%, with passenger numbers in 2019 hitting 14.7 million. Quite rightly, Edinburgh Airport badges itself as where Scotland meets the world. Gordon has kept the airport operating throughout the pandemic, but I know that the levels of passenger numbers has plummeted. He's a great advocate for his sector, and we all look forward to hearing Gordon's thoughts.
Thanks very much, Shirley, and it's a pleasure to be here celebrating the sort of festival of business with the Chambers of Commerce, and it's great to be on here with so many other colleagues that I've worked with over many years. And actually, my history covers many modes. Started off in buses actually and trains with First Group before coming into airports. So connectivity at all levels is something I've sort of lived with and tried to strive for throughout my career, because I think it's so important. And I think we all understand that, you know, we've got alternatives to that, and we've all been more used to digital means than we ever have in the last 11 months. But equally, I think that experience demonstrates that while it can be really efficient and as an alternative in many cases, sometimes the best alternative, in many cases it's very much the secondary alternative, where you can't do everything as efficiently or as effectively. And what I mean by that in business terms in particular is it may be fine to have a meeting internally weekly to do a quick catch up with people you know well, but it's very difficult to establish new relationships and partnerships with people you don't know over a digital medium, where getting face to face and being able to sort of get to know each other as well as do the transactional stuff is a key part of it. Just sort of going into what do we mean by connectivity? I think it is about physical ability for transactions, whether it's cargo or people. I'm going to sort of focus really heavily on tourism, and the reason I want to do that is I think it's something everyone kind of feels for. It's a very visible part of what the airport does, but it's also the largest employer in Scotland and possibly could be one of the worst hit through the pandemic, and therefore really worth thinking about what connectivity will mean in the future and how we might sort of recover from where we are today. And that 2012-2019 journey that Edinburgh Airport's been on is a really good example of that. We went from having 25 airlines up to 37 airlines, so a huge range of choice, so people have preferences and have access to different things. 130 routes back in 2012 to 221 in 2019. So every single one of these new routes, a new opportunity to talk to a whole different geography, whole different set of people that would otherwise be put off for having to use 2 planes or some other force of travel and possibly just not come at all. And the one I think is most striking is we went from one long-haul route, which was a Newark Airport United Airlines, to 11 long-haul routes, including Beijing, a couple of Middle East sections, and a huge expansion in North America, both Canada and America, and really, really impactful. And in tourism terms, not only was that opening up new volume, but it was opening up new value. Prior to this big expansion, an American tourist would typically spend about 4 times what an English tourist would spend in Scotland. And that's obviously very important. And believe it or not, a Chinese tourist on average is spending 3 times what an American is spending. So where you're worried about sustainability and you're worried about value, you're worried about overall the benefits of tourism, high-end, longer duration, as it turns out, from further afield tends to be better for us. And connectivity is the only thing that can make that happen. Nobody was going to come in the numbers they did unless there was direct connections into Edinburgh from Beijing. And we saw that in spades with a huge rise in the number of Chinese visitors that both used that route specifically, but the very existence of that route and the experience of their local networks back in China meant that people were encouraged to think differently about where they might choose to go to. And Scotland featured very, very highly on that as a result. So that's all I'll say about connectivity. Hopefully it's self-apparent why connections make a difference to the human state, whether it's art in the festivals or whether it's in education in the universities, or as I say, through tourism, where we're very directly benefiting from people's spending. So what I'd like to sort of really leave you with in this very short introduction is that the recovery is going to be competitive. And what I mean by that is we are going to be competing in aviation for less number of airlines with less fleets, less aircraft in their fleets. And they're going to be looking at how do they rebuild their own position and what are their priorities going to be. Now I would suggest the first thing that's going to happen is where they're allowed to operate, i.e. where are the boundaries going to be in terms of border controls, in terms of quarantine announcements, in terms of what we need to do for testing. And I would just leave hanging the fact that Scotland is currently the strictest anywhere in Europe at the moment. And that might be seen as risk mitigation, but it's equally a commercial barrier. We've, on top of that, got Brexit restrictions, where I don't think we've even started to understand the impact of that yet, because everything is masked by low volumes and everyone focused on other things, i.e. the pandemic, and we're not really understanding the friction that's been put into the systems. Never mind the sort of social view about Britain being an unwelcoming place now to many Europeans. We've got a historically high tax status, the highest taxation in aviation anywhere in the world. That was a constant hindrance for us in the past. And when we're coming out of it and other governments have been throwing money at our airlines, our airports and reducing barriers to travel, we've done nothing on that yet. And therefore is another problem that we're going to have to battle through that was there before. And fundamentally, I don't see any plans yet for people's being promoted to think about travel in the future, think about marketing, to think about why Scotland might be one of the early places you want to come to, which makes no sense to me, given we're ahead on vaccine, we're ahead on many things, and many of the attributes of the Scottish tourism market, i.e. space and remoteness, might be quite attractive when people are thinking about travelling again for the first time. None of that has been put in place. So there's not even the semblance of a future plan about reconnecting Scotland after. And yet the airlines are deciding already what they're going to be doing for the back end of the summer and into next year. So I'll just leave you that thought that if I'm right, and I'm fairly certain I am, that this is going to be a competitive environment to recover, we are at the moment pretty poorly placed to be successful in that. And I think we need to do a lot of soul searching and a lot of thinking about how we're going to put ourselves far further up the ladder for where the airlines think about reinvesting again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Gordon. And that resonates with a lot of the things that we've heard in the Edinburgh Business Resilience Group that the Chamber are currently running. And hopefully we'll come back to that in the question and answer session that will follow our presentations. So we're going to move now from airplanes to railways, important for passengers and for freight. And I'm delighted that we're joined today by David Horne, who I believe has spent his entire career in rail. He worked in the East Midlands in charge of one of the major regional operators before becoming involved with the East Coast Line in 2015. He has always had a very strong focus on customer experience, and in his last year at the East Midlands, his company won the Passenger Operator of the Year. Now firmly at the helm of LNER, he has to deal with the introduction of new rolling stock, the great new trains whizzing us down to London, and further investment in infrastructure in partnership with Network Rail. I found it quite interesting in preparing for our session this morning to look at the way in which passenger numbers had been affected, and certainly against how I had thought they would be, in that the area that suffered most in passenger reduction numbers has actually been London, and then the regions are doing quite well on it. So very much looking forward to David's views on how rail will contribute to our recovery.
Thank you very much. Yes, good afternoon. It's a pleasure, as Gordon said, to be able to have this conversation this afternoon. I mean, clearly we're at a moment as we look forward to the next few weeks and months, and we hope to be in a position to emerge from the pandemic and the sort of current circumstances that we're in. And I think one of the key questions that will probably each of us will probably touch on this afternoon, and no doubt in the Q&A, is actually about the future of cities, because all this Zooming that we are doing and these video conferences, of course, potentially could actually undermine the fabric of what our cities are there to do, and very much the benefits of the cities that we have. And you know, there's no better place to illustrate the power of a city, in my view, than Edinburgh, where the sort of ecosystem of businesses and experiences within a city really does come together really well. So perhaps we'll touch on some of that, because for us as transport businesses, you know, cities are absolutely key. Gordon, of course, is probably serving a region as well as cities, but as a rail business, we're very much serving city centres to city centres. As you know, we have been investing in improving rail services on LNER over the past few years with the introduction of the new Azuma trains. We've actually been doing plenty on that during the past year. We've not had that many customers, although we did have a good number last summer as people were making leisure journeys around the country, and you know, people couldn't go abroad as much, so people made plenty of leisure journeys. But apart from that, we've actually been really busy trying to get some of the infrastructure improvements underway on the East Coast main line, the route that we operate on, to really get ourselves ready for the future, and for providing better connectivity between our cities throughout the UK for when people can travel again. So at the moment, we've actually got major work that's just started at King's Cross Station in London, upgrading 50-year-old infrastructure there. Back in January, there was a project that closed the route, our main route, for a week to get a tunnel pushed under the East Coast main line to enable us to have some extra capacity on the route to run some extra services from next year. So I'm hoping that we've made some good use of the time that we've had over the past year when we've had fewer people travelling, because there's no doubt in my mind there will be a need for it. There will be a need for us to ensure excellent connectivity between our cities, not only within the UK and within Scotland, but actually within Europe and across the world. Cities, I believe, we will find have a very strong future, and our part, of course, is to ensure that we are providing excellent transport links so that people do not feel that Zoom or Microsoft Teams or these other things is an adequate substitute. And perhaps we'll come and talk about some more of that later on.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for that. And we'll maybe come back to some of the changes you are seeing in passenger behaviour as part of the Q&A. So, having heard from aviation and rail, we're going to now hear from Joshua Ryan-Saha, who is involved in a very important but largely invisible part of our connectivity, and that's Traveltech, which takes so many forms in ensuring that transport works effectively and efficiently, that we as users of transport and that connectivity also have excellent access and understanding of it. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing his views. Joshua has long been involved in, excuse me, innovation. He worked for Nesta, the sort of UK's national innovation think tank, before he joined Data Lab in Edinburgh, at the forefront of how we use data analytics to inform not only business decisions, but policy decisions and beyond. And he's now with Traveltech, which is hosted by the Edinburgh Futures Institute at the University of Edinburgh. So welcome to Joshua.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. I've got to say I feel very privileged to be on the panel with such esteemed colleagues. And over the years, I've been a very, very heavy user of many of the services that they've been responsible for. In fact, I think my life has probably been spent on each stop of the LNER journey, having come from Grimsby and been in New York and Doncaster and various other places. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to focus, as has already been said, on travel technology and how, I guess, digital technology enables that physical connectivity, which is so important. But I think first it's probably worth just reflecting on the last year and thinking about something that Rafat Ali, who is the author of Skift, the travel magazine, said, I think it was a couple of years back, where he spoke about travel being the biggest industry in the world. And I think we felt it. We felt it so so much of a core to the last year has been our inability to travel and experience new things or go see the people we wanted to see. That physical connectivity is the thing we've missed the most. And also, I think the importance of a travel industry has been highlighted, not just because we've missed it when it's gone, but also the potential impact on global health, the impact, of course, on climate change and various things like that. So it is probably the most important industry in the world, and it's going to hopefully recover in the coming years. So when I think about travel technology, it is very much the digital enablement of that physical connectivity. And Scotland is very good at doing travel technology. And I think it probably goes under the radar quite a lot. Is home to Skyscanner, probably the UK's largest travel tech company and a global company. And not just is it home to Skyscanner, but people have come and gone, have become experts in travel technology, have made money in travel technology, and we need to be taking advantage of that. One of the things that has happened since the crisis has taken hold is travel technology, if anything, has become more important. And it's become more important because it has enabled businesses to operate where they can, to pivot to a local market. If they were focused on international tourism, they've had to use digital tools. I think about the wonderful Edinburgh lockdown economy set up by Tom Harris, and how that has been enabled all these different companies to actually start selling the physical products to a local market when so many were reliant on the wonderful international visitors coming across the world to visit this great city. But it's not just been that, it's been when we did open up, albeit for a very short period of time, how we could do safe payment technology, how we could do better insurance, or it could be the track and trace processes, that if you could do it digitally, you could build up your customer base and you could bring them back and make longer term customers. It could be about how you reduce your costs, doing efficient resources, maybe using sensors to work out how much you're spending on heat and electricity and cleaning and all these sorts of things in a hotel estate. It could be a time slot booking that has been implemented in attractions and museums so that people could still enjoy it, but in less crowded environments. All of these things have taken place. And that's without even saying about the digital experiences that we've all been on Zoom for, hopefully with theatrical productions, trying to maintain some of those great acts that make Edinburgh so wonderful during the festivals. So I think when I talk about travel tech, I often talk about it, people can see it sometimes as something that doesn't take place in the physical world, but it is all about enabling that physical connectivity. And I think an investment in travel tech now is going to be really, really important to making sure when that physical connection can come back, it is boosting our economy in an inclusive way.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Maybe we might have some questions on how travel tech can contribute to net zero as well, another important aspect of all that you are fostering at the moment. And now to our final panelist, something that's very close to my heart, which is buses, believe it or not. My family used to have a coach company, and I am very delighted to welcome Fiona Dougherty, who is Managing Director of Stagecoach Scotland West and a great supporter of the Chamber network. Fiona had a very successful career in oil and extractive industries before she moved into transport. She has experience in aviation and logistics and is actually a fellow of the Institutes of Transport and Logistics. And I'm delighted that she's going to tell us about how Stagecoach in particular, but how the coach industry will contribute to our economic recovery in the future.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and thank you very much, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to come along and talk as part of the panel. I think you've got a good variation between the four of us, so hopefully we can cover a multitude for you. For me, connectivity is very much, perhaps, as you would expect, possibly more local with bus in terms of how we think about it. Although we obviously do have cross-border and city-to-city connections, when people think about bus, they think about much more local transport, I would suggest. So that connectivity is connectivity with each other. It's that human element that everybody has suffered so badly from over the last year and not being able to meet each other. It's connectivity with other transport modes. So how do we link things together? You know, it's no one element that makes transport work. It has to be a combination of things. And that now needs to link on to some of the differences in behaviour, I think, that we've seen over the last year as people have perhaps got more used to thinking about active travel and how they actually use that active travel to link into that overall connectivity. So, you know, there's been a lot of change over the last year. People's work patterns have changed completely. Everybody's had different experiences of that. And as a transport industry, we need to be flexible and we need to be able to adapt to what people need. We are a derived demand, so it's really important that we understand how the travel patterns are going to develop. And it's still quite early for that, to be honest, but we are still working on you know, trying to make sure that we are in position for that. And it is a bit of a watershed moment for us. We have an opportunity to look sustainably about how we change how we live and work. And any of the strategic priorities that we set right now will shape not only the world that we want to live in at the moment, but also the world that future generations will want to live in. And we talk about a green recovery, so we need to think about how we come out of the pandemic and how we link into making sure that we don't lose track of that. But clearly very important to ensure that we get that economic growth as part of it. And public transport, particularly bus, pre-pandemic, there was roughly in Scotland 350 million bus journeys a year were made. So to put that in a little bit of perspective, and I'm going to use a UK figure here, Stagecoach is about 25% of that in Scotland. But overall, Stagecoach contributed 1.6 billion to the UK economy in 1 year alone. So I think, you know, bus, and I've worked in a number of different industries, I think bus is an underestimated transport model. It connects people with jobs. You know, as we're coming out of the pandemic, we need to think about how we get people back into jobs, how we get people to skills, education, development. We need to make sure that we do continue to draw families together and that we can allow friends and communities to come together, because that's what people really at their heart on their day-to-day, I think, for me, have missed. And I think that's really where bus plays a huge part. So I think for me, there's very much that local element, but also, and David's touched on it, the cities element. And we know the cities have been badly hit as a result of the pandemic, and we see that in the way that people are travelling. So even though we're in lockdown and even though it's essential journeys anyway, we can see very quickly that the travel patterns into the cities are much more badly affected than the travel patterns around some of the local town networks. So how will that recover? How can we support it to recover? And you know, what are employers thinking about in terms of their future operations in those types of locations, I think is really pivotal for me. So I'll leave that at that point, Fiona, and look forward to taking any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Fiona, for that. One of the things I'd like to do is building actually on something that you've just finished with, Fiona, and tying it back to Gordon's last remarks, which was all about, Gordon was speaking about it in the context of tourism, but basically consumer confidence, in the sense of what do you each feel that you now need to do to encourage people? What role does technology play in encouraging passengers in particular to go back to public transport? I understand that, you know, during the first lockdown and the last quarter of 2020, we saw a phenomenal rise again in the use of the car and single person use of the car. And if you think in the context of Edinburgh, we've done a great job through the very, very excellent sort of public transport we've got through going in buses and everything, where we were seeing a decline. But what will be required, you know, what are you all thinking about? Does it mean changes in configuration of vehicles? Does it mean literally changes in onboarding, ticketing? Just wonder, what are the things that you're all thinking about how you will go about encouraging people that it's good to get back onto to public transport. A really important part, I think, also in persuading employers to get people, particularly city centre offices, to get people back. So sort of questions, and you know, I'd love to hear your views on that. So
shall I kick off?
David? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think it is absolutely a key question. I mean, clearly, excuse me, we've clearly had people who have been travelling throughout the last 12 months, you know, whether they are key workers, journalists actually, who need to be in TV studios, and clearly people who, you know, need to be somewhere to do their work. We've seen them travelling throughout, and so we've got people actually who are quite confident about travelling at the current time. But at the other extreme, of course, we've got people who are really nervous about travelling, and you know, I think it's probably fair to say that some people will even be nervous after they've been vaccinated. So there's very much, in my view, a confidence building thing to do. It's something that probably as public transport providers we need to do in conjunction also with businesses who have offices, because there's no point one doing one and not doing the other. Offices, the safety of offices and the confidence around the office workplace goes hand in hand with the public transport system, I think. What we have seen from our own customer research, you know, my word, there's been huge amounts of customer research done over the past year, is actually once people experience what it is like on our services, then actually that gives people a huge amount of confidence. You know, we've invested in extra cleaners. We've got now 330 cleaners on our services. We've got social distancing on board our services at the moment, and certainly you know, for the next 6 months that will be the case. We'll review it probably later in the summer, and you know, the whole environment feels clean and safe as it can be, and so we get really quite high levels of customer satisfaction and customer confidence from those people who are traveling. The challenge is from people who haven't traveled and haven't experienced that, and you know, so it's probably like many of these things about communication and about reassurance.
Thank you, David. Who'd like to comment next?
I'm happy to come in, Fiona. I mean, I think, you know, David's absolutely correct. I think we've lived very much in a world for the past 12 months where we've obeyed a message, and the message has very much been avoid public transport, use it for essential purposes only. And I think it's really important people try and remember, and we need to give people confidence to remember that that's not because it was dangerous to travel on public transport. It's because actually we were trying to keep people physically apart from each other. That was the intention, in the same way that we were being asked not to mingle in homes, we were being asked not to mingle in public transport. But I think perhaps we need to be aware that that message has got a bit guddled. And it would be, I think, helpful to, as much as it was a strong message to avoid using public transport, take the evidence that is there, and the evidence is very strong that there is no transmission. You know, we've been very fortunate, both in terms of staff and also in terms of passengers. We haven't seen any problems. Difficult possibly at the start because the public health guidance was changing all the time, so we had to be very reactive as the guidance was coming out and put in different things. But now I think the passengers who do travel with us have got a confidence level that they can come on, they can use contactless payment if they need to. But we also need to remember that not everybody has got a bank card, so not everybody is able to use contactless payment. Obviously, people have been asked to use face masks. You know, we put social distancing in, so as long as social distancing is in place, then, you know, we try and obviously keep people apart. So I agree with David. I think you've got to remember there's been a lot of people who have continuously travelled through this period, and actually they are very confident. And I don't think they'll be the issue. I think the question for us as an industry is actually, how do we take the people who never travelled with us and give them the confidence to travel with us? And it's those people who are probably, a lot of them, using those single-use card journeys, which cause congestion, which from a bus particular point of view means that, you know, you get on a bus and you don't always know you're going to get to your destination at the time you need to, because you might get caught up in motorway traffic or something. So if people can have that reliability, that predictability in how they travel, that will make a big difference for them. So we need to think about what is it that's going to make those people travel differently, and they're one of the most significant parts to trying to encourage that green recovery as part of what we're doing.
Well, maybe given the great esteem and respect there is for key workers across the land, and increasingly, if you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, apparently when we are looking for information, we're more likely to trust information that comes from a peer rather than from an expert. So maybe we need to encourage key workers to persuade us all that it's safe to return. But I mean, Joshua, building on a question in the Q&A from Helen Robertson, what role could Traveltech play in encouraging us all to get back to using public transport?
Yeah, it's just on the point of confidence, I was just thinking about something I saw on LinkedIn the other day, which was from Super Control, which is one of the Scottish booking systems for self-catering. And on the announcement of the tiering of, well, opening up, their bookings just went through the roof. So there's confidence in tourism, at least domestic tourism, and it's coming back, and with the ability to quickly get your money back. But I'm not sure it'd be related to public transport. I think it's probably most people go to rural locations, perhaps going on their cars. I think it's going to rely on vaccines and monitoring arrangements. As soon as we've hit a certain point of herd immunity through vaccination, and people are confident that new variants are not overcoming that vaccine, I think that's going to be the main big moment. And then that's when you really have to kick into the sort of confidence building. Some of the stuff I've seen from the attraction sector has been video walkthroughs and things like that. To sort of just feel it, experience it, know what it's going to be like when you're there again. Busyness information, you know, that type of thing. If you can provide a relatively live data stream of how busy things are, that might help. They're the types of things that I would envisage. On the specific question that came in around sort of future technology, I know there was a suggestion of a potentially an integrated vaccine or global health sort of passport almost. I'd be relatively skeptical about how it could be achieved, because I think it requires global cooperation on a whole new system of travel. It may work, but probably not enough global cooperation on vaccines at the moment, never mind the travel arrangements. I'd hope it could work. I think there's simple things like, I guess, mobility as a service or more connected transport. So rather than going into queues, rather than going and buying another ticket, rather than bulking, trying to get on the bus all at the same time, getting all that sort of stuff, but it's much more smooth. It's perhaps more demand orientated, especially when you're going from one mode to another. So I would think that investment in mobility as a service technology would feel like, to me, the area to go.
Yeah, because I guess building on what David was saying about building confidence, it needs to be done in conjunction, particularly for cities, with businesses with large offices in city centres, because I guess one of the things that we might see is a very different rush hour now, in that if people have got flexible working, instead of having sort of concentrated periods of travel by commuters, is it going to differ? And I guess if you had data that was real-time data that was available to say how busy traffic was, that will influence, across all modes, that will influence how people make their choices. Gordon, you had commented really on building confidence for people coming into Scotland. Are you seeing an upturn in people resident in Scotland being doing more air travel or not? And if not, what more do you think your part of the industry needs to do to build that confidence?
Yeah, so I think as with everything, there's going to be a variety of different approaches to this. There's going to be people like me who the first opportunity to travel will take it, and just desperate to get back to some sort of normality. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's going to be people that are terrified to go out the front door. And I don't think we can pretend that we can deal with all at the same time or in the same way. So we're going to have a period of time where we're going to have to reassure people through cleanliness, through social distancing, through some of the the face masks, all that sort of stuff. But equally, I don't think that can last. Public transport doesn't work with 2-metre segregations, and yet the costs of the alternative to public transport are pretty horrendous as well in terms of pure transport terms, private cars. But worse than that, the economic impact of having people constrained and not being able to access jobs or be able to generate other parts of the economy. So I think this is about the kind of horses for courses, where we'll be in a transition period, and within the sector, we know that, for example, domestic tourism will come back before international, because there's going to be a combination of confidence and government restrictions. There's going to be less business travel, because arguably it's easier to replace that using digital technology, at least in the short term, for some purposes. But equally, I don't think we'll fundamentally change the value of connectivity and the value of travel, which is about people experiencing things, people developing relationships, people part of being university is not just receiving the lecture, it's being in the community of other students and what that means for you. Part of, you can watch the telly, but it's not the same as being at the Edinburgh Festival. So for me, there's always an additional layer of value of having people together, collaborating, being creative, sparking off each other, even down to the fundamental of, if we want to have international collaboration, it's going to be a lot easier if we can meet together. Now, I'm much more optimistic about things like, global health passports and so on, because I think they're a necessity. I think they will come, we'll find a way. And in a sense, aviation security is both a good and bad example of that. Aviation security is dictated the standard by world governments, either European or world level, and the private sector gets on and delivers to that. So there's a model that works really well that we haven't deployed during this pandemic, and I think that's been a great missed opportunity. But equally, it can be really badly deployed. So fairly contentious for somebody in the aviation factor, but the liquids rule was a complete waste of time and always was. But because government said it was important, they find it impossible to walk away from it. So we're stuck with a liquid rule that never achieved anything. And in fact, we're now going through another massive iteration of investment in new technology to retain a standard that achieves nothing and makes the customer service. Actually, one of the biggest causes of queues in airports is the liquid rule. So, we've got to get this balanced risk view, and it's got to be a phased transition where this will be like the flu. And I don't know whether that'll be in 2 years' time or 10 years' time. But COVID will be like the flu. Now, the question is, have we fundamentally changed society for the better as a result of that challenge? Or in 10 years' time, are we living with the equivalent of the liquid rule that's achieving nothing but putting costs and disbenefits in people's way, and arguably causing more problems, because you can actually create unintended consequences that go with that. So that's the kind of challenge I would do. And I'm really worried if we're looking for a balanced response from government where there's no signs of that yet. You know, so I'd like a lot more detail about like, what are we trying to achieve in the end state and what are the stages that get us back to the end state.
Well, a question for you and for the panel, building on a question that Julian Slatter has popped into the Q&A. Here we are in the week when the UK Chancellor will be delivering his budget. So what's your ask from UK government? What's your ask from Scottish government? And what's your ask from Edinburgh City Council?
Well, if I go very quickly, it's about creating the conditions for recovery, and that's come back to my view that the recovery will be competitive. In my world, that's international, and the world of some of the other people around there, it's just about creating an environment where, you know, we allow the offices to fill up again, so that we've got reasons to be in city centres, and you know that's got so many more profound social impacts than it does about property impacts, doesn't it? So you know, there's a whole host of things about creating the environment, go back to it, and that's about government understanding the whole value chain. Now, in my world, that could be the practicalities of let's give it an APD holiday, you know, the highest aviation tax in the world, being uncompetitive in a competitive recovery will look very silly in 2 or 3 years' time. So there's a very specific ask. You know, we're not asking for a bailout as an organisation to say we will survive this, but we need to have a tourism industry that can actually work for us to have anybody wanting to fly to Scotland. So it's about creating the conditions for the recovery and looking at that long-term investment, preserving capability and capacity for all the things that we value and we know contribute so strongly to our economy and to our social life. You know, I could give you 20 examples of that, but what's really important is that we don't throw money after bad. We have a phased restriction reduction and we invest and retain capacity for the longer term future.
Okay, thank you, Fiona. David or Joshua, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I think for me, you know, that so bus throughout the pandemic has had support through it, and that's been to allow, you know, key workers to travel, allow emergency access to healthcare, and allow people to get to kind of key services through it. However, that support is there because you can't make money while you have social distancing in place. It's just physically impossible, and also it doesn't allow us to invest. So there's a little bit of a dilemma here, and the dilemma is, how do you come back out of the restrictions that we've had, and you know, have that transition that Gordon's kind of touched on, because we have to have that. But it's actually not good enough to just do it the way that we have just now, because if we are going to achieve some of the things that we are targeting, like, you know, zero emissions in 2045, which is the Scottish Government target, then we have to start investing in fleet. And that's got to happen sooner rather than later. So, you know, I think my ask is that they don't just look at one bit in isolation. They have to have a bit more of a holistic approach. And if all we do is come out of the pandemic and go back to where we were, some people might say that's a good place to get to. I don't think it is. And certainly from a Scottish Government point of view, surface transportation is the single largest growing source of carbon emissions. That's just a fact. But people might be surprised to know that, you know, 6% of that is due to bus and 41% of it is due to cars. And I think a lot of people kind of tend to look at it and think that's not my problem. But it has to be approached from both directions. One, people have to want to come away from the cars. And secondly, you know, the people who are supplying public transport need to provide a service that people want to use. So it has to come at it from both sides. But from a policy point of view, there also needs to be something that says, actually, you know, we're not going to necessarily make it overly easy for people to use cars, because right now it is, and there's no disincentive to do it. So actually, to achieve those targets, something has to change.
People on the call who are as old as I am may remember that Edinburgh was actually in the forefront, and in a time when we talk about referendums, Edinburgh, I think, was the first city in the UK to have a referendum on congestion charging in the early 1990s, and it was roundly defeated. I wonder if it's maybe time to bring it back. Joshua, David, anything you would like to add on sort of what you'd like governments to do to support you in the recovery?
Yeah, I think Fiona's made a really good point about, let's ensure the future is different to the sort of past we left behind a year ago. There's no doubt. I mean, we've done some research towards the end of last summer, actually, which highlighted how people want to build back greener, shall we say. Mm-hmm. And just looking at a couple of comments in the questions around 20-minute cities, I think from Jane, and the idea of a shall we say, a multimodal travel pass. I think from Heidi. I mean, some of these things, we've been living a very car-dependent existence, I think it's fair to say. And we're probably all guilty of it to some extent. But what our research indicated is that people are looking to move away from that, and in particularly young people. And I think there is an opportunity for our cities and for us as public transport operators to really reflect on that and help government to come up with policies and initiatives to really shift people off this car dependency. It's going to be easier to do that coming out of this pandemic than it was a year ago. So we should be taking advantage of that.
And maybe building on Gordon's point earlier about how competitive we are, maybe there is a sort of an argument for some form of Scotland travel pass that makes it very easy for people when they arrive at any airport in Scotland, that they instantly, that they can go on to, through the help of the companies that Joshua is supporting, that you can go on to a portal, which is Scotland Travel, and you can pre-book or you get some sort of pass that is truly multimodal, and you can use it on train, bus, car hire, whatever might be a step forward. Joshua, you were going to come in.
Yeah. I think just dwelling on what you were saying, that'd be an exciting prospect. It's difficult. It's always very difficult to do because of different standards of organisations in terms of the ticketing and authorisation and various things like that. But it could be a really exciting vision for the future. I think from government, in answer to the first question, I think I don't have the same responsibilities as the other members of this panel, so I'll focus on something else slightly different, which is still having more just clarity as much as possible about what's happening, continued financial support, especially for small hospitality businesses, because I think it's just a constant leaking ship, even with more support going in. And then a very, very specific thing is the Digital Boost programme in Scotland, which was really good, but opened and closed on the same day. And, there was so much demand, so much potential there for these different tourism and hospitality and other small businesses that really wanted to use this time to experiment, build in new infrastructure, become more efficient, all this sort of stuff. And then it was kind of given to them, taken away. And I think that's the demand itself shows there should be an additional tranche of money there.
Good. Okay. So moving on from that, Joe Goldblatt, who's a great supporter of these events, has asked a number of questions around the role that physical connections play in social cohesion. And I wondered if in any of your organizations you've been giving any thoughts to how through new processes that you can build things to make it easier for us to return. What is the role of transport? What beyond its core purpose can it do to help us all? Does that mean different spaces in airports or bus stations or railway stations? I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I'll pick that up from a bus perspective. First of all, you know, I think it's so important for people to feel comfortable and want to actually be together and travel together. So, you know, as David's touched on as well, we've had to take some time and think about how we position ourselves and how we try and get the best possible outcome for the customers going forward. So, you know, things like contactless on buses and continuing the sort of deep cleaning, etc., that we have in place, I think are just, you know, non-negotiables, to be honest. They just need to be there. But we've taken the time to develop a busy bus app, so you know, you can actually look and see how busy a bus is and whether there's space on it for you. So if you're somebody who perhaps is more worried about travelling, then you could, you know, make your choice that you want to wait an extra half hour and get a bus that's less busy rather than a bus that's more busy. And I think that's been very well received by a lot of people. I think the other thing from our perspective is we've taken the opportunity to try and make it simpler for people to travel, because I think particularly in the bus industry, a lot of the feedback that we get, actually both from staff and from our customers, is it's very complicated. And it's complicated because there's lots of different ticket types, lots of different zones, lots of different local descriptors in terms of how things have been done. So, you know, we've taken the opportunity across Scotland right now to do a fare simplification, and that simplification is specifically aimed at trying to recognise that people's travel habits will change. So people will need to travel more flexibly. So where they travelled 5 days a week before, they now maybe only need to travel 3 days a week. Well, actually, do we have a product that will allow them to do that? So I think, you know, those are the types of initiatives that we're taking into account, and also trying to ensure that there's consistency, so that again, as things have kind of grown up over time, the price of a single ticket in one place is different to the price of a single ticket in another place, but you're in the same company. So actually, how do we make that easier for the customers so that they know when they buy that ticket, they know what it is they're buying and where it gets them to, and what the sort of restrictions are. So I don't doubt it won't be perfect, but you know, hopefully it goes a long way. And so far, it's been really positively received by everybody. So that's good.
That's great, and that's really important on inclusion initiatives as well, isn't it? Is that having sort of products that are tailored for those who are just about managing. I mean, it's clear from what we've heard from you all today that you are taking your own measures to respond as effectively as you can, and you know, sort of you're great models for this sort of agile, responsive organisations we've all had to pivot to. Now, one of the issues is that on some of the changes we require, which is in policy, governments have to lead on those. And as Catherine Leach has put in the Q&A, that can take some time, you know, for Gordon, if you've got international treaties you're trying to deal with, so on and so forth. So I wondered if you had any, if you were for a moment the sort of Cabinet Secretary for transport, what would you be doing now to try and cut through these issues, to have an accelerated process to set the policy framework to support the economic recovery through connectivity and also net zero?
So, shall I go first?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think I wish it did take ministers time to draft policy, because the last 6 months they give us about 24 hours to respond to some stupid policy that achieves nothing and fails miserably from day one, but that's another matter. So I think it's about clarity about where we're trying to get to. So this route map everyone talks about how we're going to get from A to B, and not necessarily the timing, because the pandemic doesn't allow you to forecast dates very effectively, but you can track conditions. So first of all, that's the first thing about the recovery model, about what stages are we going to go through to get back to something approaching normal, before we start thinking about, well, how might the new normal be, you know, fundamentally different to what it was before. I think an awful lot of stuff we've heard about is about offering choice. I think, again, reflecting on the fact that the difference between someone that's going to be terrified of the history of this pandemic versus someone that's either because they don't feel particularly exposed to the risks or because they've had the vaccine or whatever it is, or just because they've got a different risk appetite, is going to be very different. And I think even individuals can want different things at different times. And if you're traveling as a solo businessman person, you want something completely different to when you're traveling with your family. And that can equally equate into what you want in terms of safety and health around the pandemic or anything else for that matter. There are times when actually being in a crowd is part of the enjoyment of the process as well as I think, but nobody wants to stand in queues. Nobody wants to be confused by the process or find it difficult to do something. So there are some fundamental truths there about simplicity, choice, offers, and ease of travel that I think are going to be true throughout. And I think technology's got a huge amount to offer us that, as well as just rethinking how do we deliver across a number of things. In terms of the sort of green agenda, I think technology is our biggest saviour. I think there's huge amounts of technology coming our way, whether it's fuel technology, transition to electric power, even in our industry, one of the harder ones, we're seeing renewable fuels being talked about. We're already in a place where we can start talking about electric flights for up to 300-400 miles. So, all this is coming in our direction, and I'm really confident technology will be a big part of what we do. I think what's important is the sort of priorities we put in that. So, in my world, we're at the airport, we are now going to be 100% carbon neutral from this year. Now, that surprises people, but then the real problem, as we know, is we're facilitating what happens up in the sky, and they're certainly not carbon neutral yet, although they're on a pretty good journey about efficiency and all the rest of it. But then going down narrow policies that force the wrong decisions in the short term, and what I mean by that is forcing aviation to spend £500 saving a ton of carbon when you could save hundreds of tons of carbon with that same investment, is where we need to get a bit savvier. So I think we should ultimately accept the cost of travel, both in financial, economic and carbon terms, and address that challenge rather than being really bespoke and saying, here's a particular bit of the problem and we just have to focus on that. And that's what I mean by these rounded policies that government to do. What are we trying to do? We're trying to get to net zero. It's not trying to get point A to net zero first or second or third. It's about how do we as a community decide in which order we do things. And that's true of the recovery from the pandemic as it is true about the journey to net zero.
Any of our panelists have anything to add to that? That's a strong call for a holistic approach, cross-departmental approach across governments. And I think one of the things I always find frustrating is that it's UK, Scottish, local authorities, and then an international wrapper around it. And how do you encourage people to take that view? And maybe actually looking at everything through a net zero lens would actually encourage that sort of cross-working in a way that we haven't experienced before. But do other panelists have views on what governments and others should be doing on policy, how they can break the deadlock and respond effectively?
Yeah, I'll be super brief. I think it echoes what Gordon was saying. There's something around green choices and green infrastructure, I guess. And one of the things that Skyscanner do, for example, they now have, you can rank your flight on how green it is. So that's sort of one thing. We're working with a company, Electric Explorer, that are trying to make Scotland the best place to visit in an electric vehicle. So you can, so you've got charging stations, you're not having range anxiety and various things like that. And then I've seen also there's a lot of, the biggest contributor to emissions, or more than aviation, is household and business heating and energy. And I think, wherever you can drive down that use through better building management is going to be really, really critical. And then just the final thing from what Gordon was saying is sort of technology innovation around flights, but also things like carbon capture is going to be pretty important. I think also you'll see changing demand and patterns of tourism, at least. I think slower tourism, people are saying, but also perhaps people staying for longer, maybe this might happen, I'm not sure, but people taking fewer flights, but a longer flight, perhaps a more expensive flight, and then having a longer break, maybe working, being a nomad and working from multiple locations. So these are sort of things that are going to be interesting to see going into sort of net zero.
There's a great question in the Q&A from Stuart Turnbull, which is, yes, we need governments to change, but each and every single one of us need to change too. And sort of building on Richard Thaler's nudge theory, one of the great changes in waste management was the 5p carrier bag charge, which has reduced the amount of plastic going to landfill. So what are the panelists' ideas on a single simple intervention that could change our behaviour as consumers to get back on public transport? Who's going to go first?
Can I be provocative? The 5p and plastic bags has saved a lot of litter. It's not saved any plastic. We've just all got lots of bags for life in a cupboard.
Okay.
That's another matter. I think the thing that's going to change it is education. You know, I think people understanding the implications of their choices is actually really good. I mean, I'm just absolutely gobsmacked by the willingness of the younger generations now, below me, of course, to adopt this stuff and actually take it as a matter of personal pride and commitment. So I think if we give people really good education and choices where they can see how their behaviours are influencing outcomes, I think that's really powerful. So for me, you know, in my view, I mean, take tourism again, which I'm on the board of Scottish Tourism Alliance. It's kind of passion for me. You know, why? You know, we could market Scotland as the greenest destination in the world, and not only would that be leadership in terms of getting everyone else to follow that approach and therefore make a huge contribution towards net zero, but it could be a competitive advantage at the same time. Now, there's the sweet spot in terms of, you know, finding ways of, yes, it will cost us money to be world leaders in that. It will have to be at the bleeding edge occasionally, some of that technology stuff. But there's potentially a commercial benefit because you can grow your market share in the short term. So for me, that's where we need to be. And Scotland is actually very well placed to be in that sort of leadership role. One, because some of our natural resources make us got better chance than most. But as importantly, we're a really wee place and we can get everyone that matters around the table pretty quickly. And therefore, I think we should be looking at that sort of speed of change and that level of commitment, not to some rubbish target that nobody's quite sure how we get to, but actually something tangible that we can explain to the world that we're doing uniquely differently.
So sort of a big, hairy, audacious goal for all the generations that Scotland becomes the greenest country on earth, and we all contribute to that.
Or maybe just for tourism, you know, it's something that stands out from the crowd, you know, and actually, as I say, links to some commercial, because this has got to be self-sustaining. You know, nobody follows stupid leadership. If we do something that's really green that trashes the economy, nobody's going to copy it. The real value is if China copies us, it will dwarf whatever we do. But if we do something smart, they might copy it.
Yeah. So David or Fiona, have you got a sort of a simple idea that could be your 5p carrier bag charge?
It's interesting. I got asked a question on a panel a couple of weeks ago where somebody said, you know, if we actually start charging you, you know, sort of a carbon levy tax effectively, you know, do you think that will make you invest and move faster? And the answer is no, you probably put us out of business more quickly. I think that actually for me the thing is to flip it and say, actually, how do you incentivize people to get a benefit out of traveling carbon neutrally? You know, so, you know, maybe it's, you know, 5 journeys for the price of 4 if you travel, you know, in a carbon neutral way. I mean, that's fantastic. I think the challenge beside it is, and technology is progressing, it is progressing as a pace, as we all know, is we need to be able to provide the level of standard of vehicles that people are going to expect. You know, and right now an electric bus is probably still 2.5 times the price of a normal bus. So, you know, that's why it's so hard to get an investment case at the moment. Hydrogen is coming along the challenge in the hydrogen side is providing the infrastructure for fueling. You know, will it happen? Absolutely, it will happen, but it's how you make it happen quickly. So, you know, for me, it's about it's trying to get people to change behaviours, but also I think we need to look at some of the commercial models that will allow us to do this. And it always amazes me. I think people view public transport in this country very differently to they do in other countries. It's almost, you know, if I look at our demographic, you get young people without any problem at all, and you get older people without any problem at all, and then there's a bit in the middle where, you know, you lose quite a lot of people, and that starts to come with the trappings of jobs and success and the ease of car ownership, etc. You know, we have to be able to change that and move that, and I think you know, that statistic of 1% reduction in car use is about a 13% increase in bus use. You know, those are the types of nudges that will start to make a difference, to pick up on some of the earlier points.
And that, I mean, that's really interesting, Fiona, because obviously in the Q&A we've got some really excellent comments from Kenneth Good, reminding us that cars are not bad. It's maybe the way that we use them and the ownership models of them. And if you think of now how cars are financed and whatnot, now Edinburgh has got a couple, I think, of quite successful city car clubs, but maybe one of the things that could be done, particularly in cities, I think it's slightly more difficult in rural communities, but actually for government to invest much more in city car clubs and actually have the vehicles at stations. Because at the moment, I mean, they tend to be in locales. They're not, you know, they're not near stations and things, which might be an interesting way to look at it.
I think transport hubs is absolutely the key thing. You know, so actually, how do you get your electric car, your electric bike to a point that you then pick up another form of transport that links into another form of transport? That has to be the way to be smart in the future.
And I can't remember if, because one of the car clubs, I think, is the City of Edinburgh Car Club one. Maybe they could lead the way by having only electric cars in their fleet, more charging points, which would be a huge help on that. I think that, and I mean, I guess the other thing that's in Joshua's world is really relevant on the car usage as well is technology. You know, where you can see through an app, you could be doing carpooling in terms of use for your commute and everything else. And I guess that must also be as relevant at the other end of the spectrum for freight consolidators too, that we shouldn't forget about. And Joshua, do you see more application of technology in encouraging businesses and the citizen to sort of be more effective in their use of assets, so pooling assets and then being able to use them more effectively?
Yeah, I guess it's a lot of this is the sort of sharing economy stuff. I mean, I can't drive, and that's probably why I spend so much time on David's trains. But you know, which is just where I live up in North Edinburgh. There's already a lot of this. There's a huge amount of very quickly bookable cars. Not at the moment electric, but they will have to be in the coming years because of the target for 2030. So I think the sort of shared services, the sort of shared local services, that last mile stuff, I think is already happening. And you know, just an interesting point, which is kind of linked, so I might just be embellishing here, but is the cycle hire scheme in Edinburgh, and just looking at how the patterns of movement have changed, they're using their data just since lockdown, is just really interesting, because you see such the you know, people exploring the city in a completely alternative way, which is, I think, you know, it's a sharing service, it's a shared services facilitated by government. And you know, where I am, it's just packed with cyclists now, all going to Cramond and various other places. Of course, the downside of that is fewer people going to the centre. But
yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Now we've sort of circled around this in some of our questions already, but we've got one question in our Q&A to ask the panel's view on whether or not they think there has in fact been a paradigm shift on businesses' view about how we now work and travel, and whether or not, you know, has there been a fundamental change, or do you think that while there has been change, you'll continue to evolve? You know, to what extent, beyond the interruption that we've had in the pandemic, has it changed your views on how your businesses will grow in the future? Gordon, do you want to start? Or David?
Yes, I'm happy to start. I think there is likely to be, you know, quite a shift, and there's probably going to be different things that happen, if we're honest. Last week, somebody shared with me some statistics about the number of people who travelled on an August bank holiday from London Paddington, actually, to the West Country, and it was the figure before the war, the Second World War, and the figure for the first August bank holiday after the war. And so in 1938, before the war, it was 105,000 passengers who travelled from Paddington. And then when the war finished and everybody had, there were plenty of people with a bit of spare cash. And of course, there were loads of people desperate to get back and do some of the things that they'd missed. That figure went from 105,000 to 255,000. So, you know, a real boom in leisure activity. Now, of course, that was after 6 years of war. We've not been through that, thank goodness, you know. But, you know, I think on the leisure side, we are expecting that pent up demand, and it will be the cities and the countries and the regions who are ready that will clearly benefit from that. I think then in terms of the business travel and in terms of commuter traffic and things like that, then, you know, clearly the question is around the future of offices and workplaces. We've got employers, if you just take financial services, you know, you've got some employers who are selling off their offices and expecting to have fewer people in offices in future. At the other end, you've got people like Barclays and Goldman Sachs, who I think are saying they can't wait to get people back into offices because of the benefits of people being together and learning from each other in an office environment. And I think, you know, there's also probably data protection issues. You know, is it entirely right that all this company data or personal data is in somebody's home? So, you know, there will be a mix. I think, I mean, there is research, but the research I would suspect is giving us quite a wide range of outcomes. I think we've got to wait and see. But I think, you know, I think our jobs as public transport operators, there's a job probably for city councils, is to remind people that cities are strong for a reason. They bring people together, and that bringing people together stimulates thought and activity that ultimately leads to sort of competitive value.
Thank you, David. Fiona, how's it affecting Stagecoach's plans for the future? What assumptions have you made?
I think our assumption is, you know, it's going to be a bit of a longer recovery. I don't think we're seeing a switch on, switch off. Nobody's expecting that. I mean, I think what's interesting for me is when you look at the behaviour patterns of people when we've come out of lockdowns and when the lockdowns have been eased, we've gone back up to around 60% of our pre-COVID passenger numbers. Now, given that we've got social distancing in place, it's very hard to kind of get above that, and actually that's really reassuring. So that tells me that actually people do want to get back, and they do want to travel, and they do have confidence. I think it's how quickly that starts to feel more normal for them again. And to David's point, I'm not entirely sure that, you know, the commuters into the cities are really clear on how they're going to go back, whether their offices are going to open up again. You know, I've heard people say that they're seeing product. So to start with, everybody working from home was fantastic. but actually now they're seeing productivity dropping off, now they're seeing more well-being issues. And the answer probably does lie somewhere in the middle. You know, it probably is a bit more flexible, but there are also a lot of people who don't necessarily have the ability to do that. You know, they actually do have to get out and they do have to work and they don't have those choices. So I think, you know, for us, it's about making sure that we are as well prepared as we can for the passengers that are coming back, and making sure that we're actually meeting their needs. I think that's the key thing. You know, when somebody's not using something, it's because it's not quite working. So I think really challenging ourselves to say, actually, how do you get the right end-to-end solution, you know, that would let people make that choice to come across to public transport rather than, you know, just stick with using their own car or even car sharing to a certain point, because yes, it's absolutely better, and I don't doubt that, but it still creates a congestion element. So yeah, just I think for us a longer haul, but I think the travel patterns are still to be seen, but quite encouraging, I would say, so far.
Yep. And Joshua, have the last months sort of identified new opportunities for Traveltech companies that they maybe hadn't thought were there if they've been sitting around a virtual board table in January 2020 rather than March 2021?
Yeah, I think it's Traveltech and tourism companies, I think, which is that if your market is exclusively international, then you've just really, more than just struggled, you might not have survived at all. And, you know, there's a perpetual conversation in tourism around authenticity. And I think the businesses, particularly like restaurants and various things like that, that had or could grow a quick local base and be a service or a product that people locally want to have, will probably be more resilient in the future. So I think that idea of local tourism is going to be pretty still pretty well for next year when there's international visitors still quite low. It's going to be the main thing. The interesting bit's business travel, because I really don't know what will happen, but I think my hunch is that, as Fiona said, it'll be a mix. There'll be days in, there'll be days out. There'll be more working from home. It won't be perpetual. There'll be more solely work from home companies. But then things like big events and conferences, I think may still stand up. I think there'll be fewer shorter work trips. I think the Edinburgh, London market, I'm not sure. But I think the sort of going away sessions, the sort of work, I can't think of it, the work trip where you go to like learn juggling or something like that as an experience, so probably more intense and longer. I think there'll be a big market for that extended team gathering. So I think that's something to be interesting.
Yeah, thank you. And Gordon, I mean, you've had phenomenal investment plans at the airport, and what a change we've seen. You've been such an engine of growth for Scotland, not just the Edinburgh region. Has this sort of caused you to alter any of your plans for the airport?
Well, it clearly caused us to slow down, or we're not doing any investment at all. So we don't think we're going to get back to 2019 levels of overall passengers till 23 the earliest, and possibly as late as 24. And we think we'll be a bit ahead of the wider aviation market. That's the sort of scale of the impact on the aviation market and how long it's going to recover. And one of the problems is, you know, even if the UK is miles out ahead in the vaccine, you've got at the other end of the route's got to work as well. So you know, we can see some quite significant constraints geographically, as well as you know, the sort of sectors of the market as well. So that's deeply depressing, and I think it's very worrying about what that means for jobs and for tourism and for all sorts of things that go with that. But the fundamentals of our business, you know, derived demand, we're there to service other things, they are still good. You know, people want experiences. People want to visit friends and relations. Business trips need to happen to get to know new clients and to close deals, albeit I accept, you know, the regular weekly trip to London might be less frequent, certainly less duration going on now. So I think we're going to see different patterns, but the fundamental demand for travel is not going to go away. I think more painful is going to be, again, this competitive environment. There's a massive price pressure, you know, so I'm going to be competing with every airport in Europe to attract airlines to come, and the chances of preserving my pricing through that process in the first 2 or 3 years of the recovery is quite low. So, you know, and that has a ripple effect into, you know, what that means we can do in profit, and therefore reinvestment, jobs and everything else that comes with that. So this is going to be deeply painful for a long, long time. But I don't think it changes our core strategy, which is we service a phenomenal market that is Scotland. We try and do it by offering people the widest possible choice and making it as an enjoyable experience as possible, i.e. please spend more money while you're having a good time. And, you know, and we'll go with the evolving patterns of digitization, the ease of travel, and the trends of time, which is you try and make that experience as relevant and as enjoyable as possible. So none of these things have changed. It's just that we've taken a sort of probably a 25-year step backwards, and the question is how many years forward to get back to where we were. So, you know, let's hope the time machine's moving at pace.
Thank you, Gordon. That brings the question and answer session to an end. I'd just like to personally thank each of the panelists for their candour. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, and you have illustrated quite magnificently how you are the bedrock of our recovery, because we truly need people to connect, and you're the people who are able to do that. Now, events like today would not be possible without sponsors, and I would like to thank Wright, Johnson and Mackenzie, a law firm with offices in Edinburgh and Glasgow, who have sponsored this event. And I'd like to welcome Stephen Cotton, who is a partner at Wright, Johnson and Mackenzie, who's going to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sinead. I think someone earlier on, I can't remember if it was our chief exec or, no, you wouldn't do this for yourself, Sinead, said we got a stellar panel, and I wholly endorse. We're desperate on two levels as a firm with offices in Inverness and Dunblane. Connectivity, physical connectivity is vital. Those water cooler moments can't be topped, where you're mixing with someone from a different team in the business. And it's amazing how many light bulb moments are generated by those sorts of meetings. So, you know, good on you all for the thinking that you've put into this. Like you, Shona, I have a tremendous interest in the arts and was chair of the Travis Theatre from 2004 to 2014. And we're absolutely desperate for your help in, not really this year, there's going to be some sort of festival this year, but hopefully next year we will see the Cultural Olympics going again in Edinburgh, and that will depend to a large degree not only on political leaders, but on the real brass tacks providers of transport and connectivity. So I wish you all the very best on that. I don't think you're wanting to listen to an amateur rehash the excellent points you've all been making, but I have certainly listened to lots of what you said about are we prepared, Scotland, are we prepared for coming out of this horrible, weird situation? But I feel actually in fairly good hands, thank you very much, and I'll watch your efforts over the next few months and years. I think I'd like to thank the Chamber though again, because it's not easy putting together events at the best of times. And whilst again, I'm sure we're all looking forward to pressing the flesh and sharing a coffee over breaks in a physical event, I think the Chamber, in my view anyway, have just done a fantastic job. I know we've got a couple of other things we're sponsoring, and it's just a joy to be part of this sort of thing. So thank you all for those provocative at times, but also very reassuring thoughts on physical connectivity. And thanks to you, Sinead, for prompting and cheering and keeping us all engaged and going.